What's up guys, welcome to this episode of The Review Show where I'm talking video games, getting straight into it because that's what you want. Resident Evil 3 Remake. So Resident Evil 3 Remake, of course a remake of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. So I'm going to start off by comparing the two a little bit. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, when it first came out on the PS1, it was divisive in certain regards. As part of the core Resident Evil game franchise, it was always the worst one. Not saying it was bad, it's not bad at all I don't think, but comparing it to Resident Evil 1 and 2 and then all the ones that followed it, it's down there towards the bottom end for various reasons I won't get into. It's got a very interesting development history. It started off as one thing, became something else, and then to speed up the process they had to bring in elements from Resident Evil 2. So the remake then is very much the same kind of thing. Yes, they've changed certain things, in fact they've changed quite a bit. This remake is almost like taking the core idea and concept of what Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was and then kind of going its own way with it. And that's fine, I think. It gives you much more reason to go into this remake. But that being said, Resident Evil 3 Remake has pretty much the exact same highs and the exact same lows that the original had. So starting things off, we'll get to the length of the game because this is probably one of the biggest issues I have. Now, length of a game, I don't mind playing a game that's like an hour long, as long as I feel like that hour long was worthwhile. I don't mind playing a game that's hundreds of hours long, as long as it feels like the game should be 100 hours long or whatever. Resident Evil 3 took me about 5 hours to complete. Now for a big budget AAA game, a narrative driven game, that is on the shorter side of things. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think this game comes in and it tells the story it wants to tell. I enjoyed every moment of it pretty much, but it left me wanting more. It left me feeling like there could have and should have been more in there. One of the reasons the game feels short, obviously it is short, it's only 5 hours, but it's also because of the pacing of the game. The pacing of the game is breakneck. You are constantly on the run in this game because Nemesis is in there, he's hunting you down. And the game feels like a roller coaster ride. It feels like a Hollywood action movie mixed in with survival horror elements. This, if you were to transfer the story of this and the feel of this into a movie, it would be a really good Resident Evil movie. There's very little downtime in this game. There's very little in this game where you are just traveling, feeling tense, feeling the horror of what's going on around you. You get very little time to actually take it in. Instead, it's like, oh wow, I've got to run. And again, it makes it a very exciting, very adrenaline-fueled experience, but it does mean that experience is a fast one. And this is in comparison to Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is much more methodical, which is much more slower, which is much more horror focused. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, you're going through dark corridors trying to find out where you are. You're trying to avoid the zombies as best you can because they can take a beating. And there's a lot of horror in there, a lot of scary bits in there. It's all about survival, managing your inventory. That stuff is in Resident Evil 3 Remake, but there's much more of an emphasis on action in Resident Evil 3 Remake. So there's only a couple of moments where it really felt like, oh, this is survival horror. And one of those moments I felt was in the hospital, which is later on in the game. In fact, the hospital I think is probably the best moment of Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's the most that this game reminded me of, classic Resident Evil, where you're in this isolated location, you're on your own, you're trying to survive, you're trying to scavenge around for items and resources and so on. The hospital was really good at that, but I didn't feel like I spent enough time there. And the same goes for all the other locations. It felt like someone's put their hard work and effort into creating all these locations, from the sewers to the streets to the hospital, and I'm just whizzing right through them because there's either not a lot going on or the game is forcing me to be on the run so much. So to actually talk about much more the game mechanics, again this is action orientated Resident Evil compared to Resident Evil 2. The combat and gun mechanics are great, the sound design's great, the visuals are gorgeous. The Resident Evil, the RE engine is literally one of the best on the planet in terms of visuals, I think. Gameplay is classic Resident Evil. It's Resident Evil 2 Remake's gameplay with a couple of little tweaks. There's now a dodge button, for example. You can now dodge out of the way of enemy attacks, which will slow things down, allowing you to get like a counter shot in there. Comes in very handy when you're fighting the Nemesis, which we'll get to in a bit. And yeah, not a huge amount to say there. If you played Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's pretty much the same, but a couple of little things changed. They've changed the way the inventory works. You now, every time you pick up an item, it doesn't always bring up the inventory menu where you've then got to play the jigsaw puzzle of fitting it in. Now it just fits it in automatically, and if there are multiple ones, it just instantly adds them up and goes in there. So it streamlines things a bit. But you are still doing the inventory management system. Nemesis. So in Resident Evil 2 Remake, you had Mr. X hunting you down, and Mr. X was this big brooding guy who was wearing a huge trench coat and a hat which you could shoot off, and he was very intimidating, very foreboding. You could hear him clomping around the police station. Here in Nemesis, they've really amped up the threat level, perhaps too much so. Nemesis, in comparison to Mr. X, has weapons and guns. He is actively trying to kill you and hunt you down. He will fight you much more than what Mr. X did. In the Resident Evil 2 Remake, Mr. X, he would basically swing for you, he would try and grab you, whereas Nemesis, he's going to try and shoot you, he's going to try and use a flamethrower or a grenade launcher. He's got this like tentacle whip thing that he pulls out. He sprints after you, he can do a huge leap, jump and block your way and force you to have to course correct. It's relentless, and it makes for some very exciting, very adrenaline fueled moments and sequences. There are a bunch of boss fights in which you fight Mr. X, where you fight the Nemesis in this game, and that provides some variety to what Nemesis is doing. However, in comparison to Resident Evil 2 Remake, because Resident Evil 2 Remake is in this one central police station for the majority of the game, you're constantly feeling like you're being hunted down in that game. Whereas in Resident Evil 3, because you're constantly going from one location to another, there are only set moments and environments in which Nemesis is actually hunting you down. It feels much more scripted, it feels much more limited. And maybe that's a good thing, because it would get really annoying real quick if Nemesis was there throughout the entirety of the game. In fact, he is there throughout the entirety of the game, but if he was literally present through every section of the game, it would be really too much, I think. So I think they've done a good job of spacing them out and using them in certain areas. You can fight back against Nemesis. That's something you couldn't really do in Resident Evil 2 Remake. You could shoot Mr. X and beat him down, and then that would get him down onto one knee, in which case it would give you some time to get away. In Resident Evil 3 Remake, you can do something similar, where you can use all of your resources and whatever to take down Nemesis, and he would drop like some sort of supply or some sort of upgrade for your weapon or whatever. So it's much more rewarding to fight Nemesis, but it's also much tougher because it often takes like a grenade or a heavy weapon of some sort to actually do some damage. In terms of the story and the characters, this I think is the weakest part of this game, in that the story is bare bones and basic. You are a cop, essentially a special type of cop, like a special SWAT cop almost, who's being hunted down by Nemesis because, hey, you know stuff about Umbrella Corporation. And that's where the story kicks off, and it keeps going from there on. You're then heading all around the Resident Evil stuff, getting all of the mythology stuff about Umbrella Corporation and trying to take them down and whatnot. The story is very traditional, very standard Resident Evil stuff. There are some hints at Resident Evil 4, which I don't believe were in the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis game. So Resident Evil 4, I think they've announced, is getting the remake treatment next. So that's going to be interesting. They are tying this universe together in a much more cohesive way than what the original release of these games was. It'll be interesting to see what they do after Resident Evil 4 Remake. But the character of Jill, I like her, but I couldn't tell you anything about her. So I think the problem is this game expects you to know who Jill is before you play it. And yeah, of course she's in the first Resident Evil game. So if you're a big Resident Evil fan, you've already got an idea of who she is. I had a bit of an idea of who she is, but basically the opening of this game, there are a bunch of little documents you can pick up to basically find out what's going on in her life, who she is, the fact that she is looking for her brother and so on. That's kind of it. She becomes this badass character who's really cool but not that interesting. We don't get much in the way of her opinions or thoughts on things. She's very much just on the run, trying to survive, fighting back as best she can. And that's kind of all I've got to say about Resident Evil 3 Remake. It is on the shorter side, so I would say if you want to play this game, wait for it to go down in price. And that's one of the problems here, is that it was released as a full $60 or 50 odd pound game. And that's where the length of the game becomes a problem, in that they're releasing this at a full price, but I'm not quite sure if you're getting a full price experience here. And one of the reasons of that is that rather than feeling like a sequel to Resident Evil 2 Remake, it often feels like an expansion. They are using certain elements. There is a section of the game where you are going into the police station again, and you're going to the same environments and locations, seeing similar characters from Resident Evil 2 Remake. It doesn't feel like it's expanding on the franchise as a whole. It feels like, oh, here's what was going on while you were doing that. And I almost feel like this could have been DLC for Resident Evil 2 rather than a separate game. There's also the character of Carlos, who I've just remembered about. Carlos is, again, just like Jill, you get some vague ideas of who he is, enough to say like, right, he's this special tactics guy, and his sections are much more combat oriented, meaning because he does have a big machine gun as his primary weapon, and I like his sections. They are a little bit different from Jill's. They are more action orientated, they are more straightforward and linear. Ultimately, he doesn't play much differently, he's not that much interesting, and yeah, it's nice that he's there, it's nice that they have got these little areas where you play as him, but it's not a big deal, I don't think. Also, his design I think is weird. I don't like his hairstyle at all. The hairstyle is probably, it looks like he's got like this huge clump of a wig or like a mop just sitting on his head, and it doesn't look good at all. Resident Evil 3 Remake, I like the game. If you want to get it, I would say get it at a cheaper price. It's probably a cheaper price now. So yeah, if you're a big fan of Resident Evil, I would recommend it. The Last of Us Part 2, probably the biggest game of the year so far, maybe even of the entire year. Before I go into this, I'm going to say I'm not going to spoil the stories. I'm not going to go into specifics about the story or the characters as best I possibly can. So I'm going to focus in on what I liked about the narrative, what I didn't like about the narrative, without going into specific elements of it. Last of Us Part 2, let's talk about the title first. Part 2. This is very much a continuation of The Last of Us, rather than a sequel to it. Now, of course it is a sequel to it, but in terms of the story, in terms of the gameplay, it does carry on where The Last of Us left off, and it does feel like it's continuing that story. So it makes sense that it's called Part 2 rather than Last of Us 2. Minor thing, just a thing to point out. This time around you're playing as Ellie. She's older, I believe she's 19 now, and yeah, you're on a revenge mission of sorts. Not going to say why she's on the revenge mission, not going to say what her goal is, but this game is dealing with some powerful themes about revenge, about grudges, about feelings and emotions, and what's right and what's wrong. It really wants you to think about what's going on. It really wants you to understand what the characters are thinking, what they're feeling, what's going on in their mind. And it does a really good job of it. The story, I think, is good. The game as a whole, I think, is good. I think the game is constantly on borderline good, great. And I constantly jumping from either side. Is it just good game or is it a great game? I can never make my mind up. And the story is going to be divisive. There are elements of the story where it's like, oh my god, they're doing that? Oh wow, why? And there are elements where you're left scratching your head thinking, oh, I did not see that coming. Then there are some awe-inspiring, cool moments where it's like, oh yeah, you're finally doing this, that's great. Because of the reception of the first game, there was so much hype and anticipation for this one. I feel like they've deliberately tried to answer some of the things from the first game and follow up some of the things from the first game, but in a way that you didn't expect. They've tried to subvert your expectations, and most of the time it works. I think the new characters in this game are well developed and well realized. Everyone in this game, I feel like, feels like a real person. Even the bad guys, even the villains that you're just killing and as you're going through the game, where they all like calling out each other's name, and they've got like dogs and they're like screaming and crying every time you kill their dog or whatever. It feels real, it feels like it's lived in, it feels like you are actually impacting people's lives as you're going through this game, and what your actions are doing are really meaningful. The core gameplay elements in here, there are two types of gameplay basically: stealth and action. And you could also say exploration if you really want. The stealth feels much more like Metal Gear Solid this time around. You have now got the ability to go prone and hide in shorter grass. There are certain moments in this game where stealth is encouraged. Stealth works really well. I think it works better than it did in the first game. You can sneak up on people and stab them in the neck and so on. There are upgrades you can get to quicken that process. And you've still got the listen mode, so you can see where the enemies are as long as they're making noise. Combat, I feel, is a real improvement over the first game. The weapons feel like they pack a punch. It feels like they've got some weight behind them. I think it makes sense that at the beginning of the game, the weapons are swaying all over the place. They aren't the most reliable thing. And I think the first half of the game is encouraging you to be stealthy and to be smart with what you're doing, because getting into a gunfight with a bunch of people, probably not the best idea. As you progress through the game and you get upgrades, you can actually start to steady your aim and make your weapons better and much more reliable. And I think that works really well. It gives you an incentive to keep adding and customizing your weapons a bit. Then you've got the exploration elements. The exploration where you are going through gathering supplies and picking up little documents and pieces of paper to flesh out the story and see what other people in this world are doing. All of these work well together to make a gameplay experience that is one of the best ever, maybe. Everything feels smooth and fluid. One of the new combat elements you've got now is a dodge mechanic, so you can counter attacks, you can avoid enemy swings and so on, and it makes for some much more interesting, much more dynamic combat compared to the first game where you were just basically going in and trying to clobber your enemy to death. There are some new enemy types. They've tweaked some of the enemy types from the first game, so I think the stalkers now are work a little bit differently. There's a new type of like bloater which explodes and gives off like acidic pus. But for the most part in this game you're actually fighting humans. There's not much in the way of fighting the infected this time around. And there are only a couple of encounters where they are infected and humans. In fact, they probably could have done a bit more of that. But let's get into what I think the problems of this game are. The game is long. It's really long for this type of game. For a linear, story-driven narrative game, you probably expect it to be between 10 and 20 hours. That's what the first game was. This one is between 30 and 40 hours. That's how long it took me to play it. And I'm the type of gamer that's going around trying to find all the secrets and whatnot. So if you're just mainlining it, it'll be on the shorter side. But for the most part, it seems average 30 hours. That's way too long for this type of game, especially when this game has numerous moments where it's like, oh, this is the ending. Okay. Oh no, it's not, it's still going. Oh, this is the end. No, it's not, it's still going. There are numerous moments, almost like Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, where it could possibly end, but then it keeps going. And every time it does keep going, I'm liking what it's doing, but at the end of the day, it's like, oh, come on, just end already. At some point, it's got to stop. And it keeps going and going and going, particularly in the final third. I also feel like there are pacing issues in this game. Because of how long the game is, there are moments in this game where it feels like they're dragging things on. It does feel like they're stretching certain moments out, particularly in the way of gameplay events more than the story. But there are certain moments in the story where you are on your own, just traveling from A to B, with not a lot actually happening. They could have trimmed them bits down or gotten rid of them altogether. There are certain larger like open world areas. There's a moment where you're going to Seattle and you're on a horse and you can get off and on your horse and explore some of the buildings. That stuff, it's cool to have in there. The open world works well, but I didn't really feel like I needed it. And then there are other elements where certain story elements which I feel like could have been trimmed down or removed as well. It's nice to have them in there. It helps flesh out the characters and build up the world, but they're not essential. So I honestly feel like they could have took out maybe 10 hours of this game and it would have been a much better game. I also feel like the way this story's told, without going into specifics, without going into spoilers, the way the story's told is really interesting, but there's a point where it's building up the momentum. You feel like you're getting to the climax of the game and tensions and momentums are high, and it's like, oh, you're sitting on the edge of your seat, and then all of a sudden, wham, right back down to square one. And then it starts again. And I don't think it ever reaches that height again. It does build momentum again, it does build up adrenaline and tension and so on, but it never reaches that height. And it ultimately, I think it works, but that moment about 2/3 of the way through the game where it sends you right back down to square one momentum wise, it struggles to recover from that. And that could be a big turn-off point for a lot of people playing this game. And it's also worth saying, when that does happen, you've still got like at least another 10-15 hours of the game left. I feel like they could have reconfigured certain events of the story. The story is not told in a linear fashion. There are flashbacks in there, there are certain other things in there. I feel like they could have reconfigured certain events, switched them around a bit, and the pacing would have been a bit better. Of course, the experience would have been a bit different though. The way the story's told would have been different. The way the certain moments were sold would have been a bit different. I think it would have been very interesting to see how that would have worked out if they presented it maybe in a much more linear fashion, in a much more condensed, streamlined fashion. And yeah, without going into spoilers, that's kind of all I want to say about The Last of Us Part 2. I think it's a good game, bordering on being great. And yeah, if you've played the first game, you definitely have to play this. It does continue the story of Ellie and Joel. Yeah, there's a lot of emotion packed into this. This is a game that you're going to be playing through, having real mixed feelings about. There are certain things you're going to love about it, there are certain things you're going to hate about it. But ultimately, what this game's trying to do is trying to make you think. It's trying to make you understand things about yourself, about the world, about people, and that makes this game much more than a game, in my opinion. It makes this game something special. And in that regard, it's a masterpiece. Also, graphically speaking, it's absolutely gorgeous. The way the lighting works, the use of colour, and yeah, it's amazing. Some of the more horror elements of this game, where you are in pitch black using the flashlight to get through things, the fact that it plays with tone and mood so much, where there are some amped up action moments, where there are some more emotional, dramatic moments, and then you've got these much more scary horror moments. They do a good job of merging them all together, and yeah, in that way it's also a masterpiece. But Last of Us Part 2, I would say this is a game you have to play if you played the original. If you haven't played the original, you should. I would also say play the DLC of the original, which I believe is called Left Behind. And yeah, don't play this game if you haven't played any of the originals, basically. You'd be stupid to do that. Ghost of Tsushima, the last game I'm going to talk about today. This game is pretty recent. I literally just finished it 2 nights ago. I've got mixed feelings about this. Looking around at certain reviews and what other people are saying, people are liking this game, they're thinking it's a good game. Some people are thinking it's a great game, maybe even a masterpiece. I disagree with that. I think it's a very average game. So, in this game you're playing as Jin Sakai, a samurai in Tsushima during the first Mongol invasion. It's inspired by true events. It's based on the actual first Mongol invasion, and it's taking the idea of them and going in its own fantastical direction with it. But it is very grounded, very realistic. There are certain mythical elements in there where it toys around with the idea of like fairy tales and monsters and creatures, but it is a very realistic, very grounded game. It's an open world game, and there are RPG elements in there. You can upgrade your skills and abilities to get new attacks and combos and stuff like that. In terms of the story, let's start with. I think the story is pretty generic and pretty basic. You are a samurai, the Mongols have invaded, they've wiped out the other samurai, now you have to rebuild Tsushima, fight back and take control of the island. It's a sort of revenge story. Along the way you pick up allies and friends, some of which are military leaders, others are like other samurai, and others are like thieves and so on, to really get this like hodgepodge army together to fight back against the Khan who's invaded. There are attempts at some emotional moments in there. There are side stories and side missions you can go on, which will have you explore some of the other characters in much more depth. I encourage you to do that. It will make the story resonate more. I think the game does a good job of giving you a reason to care about the characters and to actually explore the characters. Problem though is that I don't think it's doing any of it in an original way. I don't think there's any originality in the types of stories that are being told and the type of the characters that are being portrayed. You've got one character whose family has been wiped out and her whole story is about getting revenge, finding out who did it and taking them down. That's it. And obviously, of course, her family's been wiped out, so she's very moody, very emotional. You've got this other character whose apprentice has seemingly turned on him. And this is actually, I think, one of the more interesting ones because it turns out there's more to this story than you think, and without going into spoilers. You've then got this monk whose brother's been taken from him and he's on a sort of revenge mission. You've got some more comedic elements. There's a smaller story about a guy who's just trying to make a buck in this world and by selling sake. But then the main core story about Jin is about him going from being a samurai and basically saying, right, we need to win this war by any cost. Does that mean I should stick to being a samurai, or do I need to go and be the ghost of Tsushima? Do I need to stop being honorable and actually do what's needed that's actually going to give us the win? And he's constantly dealing with that, and the story does force that on you, especially towards the end, where it's very clear that there's only one path you can really take. But you can only play this as an honorable guy who's confronting the enemy and saying, hey, come fight me, best man wins, face off in a duel and so on. Or you can be more stealthy and sneak up on people, stab them in the head and so on, which is less honorable. All of this works to an extent, but I don't think it's very interesting. The story is very predictable, it's very linear, it's very straightforward, and again, there are moments of emotion which I think work well, but I think one of the problems with the main story is that it is a long game. This is probably 40-hour game, something like that. The best moments of the story, in fact the best moments of the story happen after the halfway point, I would say. The big, more dramatic, emotional elements are beyond the halfway point. But it feels like they're stretched out, especially if you are going around doing all the side stuff. If you are trying to find all the collectibles and explore the world a bit more, then it's going to be even more stretched out. It doesn't feel like the story's actually got that much content. It doesn't feel like there's that much to say. It's not bad by any means. It just didn't resonate with me as much as I would have liked it to. But speaking of the side missions, yes, you have got ones that are focusing on these key characters who are linked to the main story. But there are also other ones where you can just speak to a random villager or whatever and say, oh, bandits are attacking this town, go help them out. Or, oh, something weird's going on over here, maybe you should go investigate. There are very straightforward fetch quest style missions where, go here, fight these people, go back. Or go here, stealth kill these people, find this item, go back. It's very straightforward mission structure throughout the entirety of the game, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of story. Gameplay now. This is a samurai game on one hand and it's a ninja game on the other. So you've got combat and you've got stealth. Talking about the combat though, this is where the game really shines to an extent. I think the combat is very fun. It's sword-based combat, but you've got like gadgets like kunai which you can toss out, you've got bombs and so on. There are a bunch of useful combos and techniques you can learn along the way which encourage you to actually do the side missions to unlock them. The core combat, like I said, is fun, but it's also pretty on the basic side. There's no lock-on, there's no target lock-on, so it does take some getting used to. You're constantly having to combat the camera to find out where the enemies are. It can be frustrating to begin with, but it's something you do get used to. You can counter certain attacks, you can block certain attacks. There are 4 different stances for different types of enemies. So if there's a guy with a spear coming at you, change your stance and you'll be better suited to take him on. Each stance has different techniques and combos and attacks you can use, so there is variety to it. And that's kind of it for the combat. There are certain moments where you are going one-on-one in a duel situation, which feels much more like a fighting game, sort of. And that does have target lock-on. But yeah, ultimately, the combat's fun, but I don't think it's great. I think there's much more room for improvement. Stealth. Stealth, this is where the game feels much more like Assassin's Creed. You can go and hide in tall grass, you can crouch down, you can jump on buildings to avoid being seen. You can sneak up on enemies and stab them in the head. There's certain unlockables you can get which help with your stealth, both in terms of the outfits can make you more hidden and in terms of being able to take down more guys with a stealth attack. So you can take down up to like 3 guys with one stealth attack at one point. There are also stealth weapons you can use to like distract enemies and so on. The stealth, again, it's pretty basic stuff. Nothing groundbreaking. That's the biggest problem I've got with this game, is that there isn't anything about it which I think wowed me. There isn't anything that I thought, oh, this is doing something really different. In fact, there is one thing which I'll get to in a bit, and that's to do with exploration. But yeah, in terms of story, I think it's very generic, very average. Not bad, just okay. In terms of gameplay, it's very competent, very fun and enjoyable. But again, nothing special. Exploration now. The island of Tsushima is very detailed, very layered. It feels like every distinct area has a distinct look and feel to it. There are certain areas where it is just endless fields with lots of colour and bright light, and it's very gorgeous and very idyllic. Whereas there are other areas where it's scorched battlefields and burnt down buildings, and then there are other areas where there's snowy mountains and yeah, all that stuff. So there's a lot of variety in there, and the island is quite big. There are also fox dens you can find, lots of collectible little hidden areas like temples and shrines you can explore. There's a lot of variety in actually what's on the island and what the island looks like. And these areas, they often reward you with like new upgrades or technique points and stuff like that, so it is worth doing some of them. But oftentimes you're only getting like little supplies which can then be added to your inventory to upgrade your outfit or weapon or whatever. Graphics though, this is where I'm probably going to get the most divisive response, because a lot of people are saying this game is gorgeous, and I can see why that is. The problem though, I think a lot of people are misunderstanding the difference between graphical power and art design. I think people are going around saying this is one of the best games ever made and that it's one of the most graphically impressive games ever made, when it isn't. I think you've got to be blind to think that, to be honest, because I'm playing this on a PS4 Pro in 4K in HDR on a 4K HDR TV, and I think it looks good for the most part. I think the environments are very detailed, they're very gorgeous, there's a good use of colour, the way in which the lighting works. The lighting is the real standout element in terms of the visuals. It makes everything look very stylish, very atmospheric. But I think if you ignore the lighting, and in certain regards the lighting, when the lighting isn't like in the right position or shining down in the right way, the game looks very generic. The character models in comparison to the environments I think are borderline bad. I don't like the way the characters look, I don't like the way in which the animation on the character, the way in which the characters emote and they lip sync, none of that looks good, I don't think. The characters don't look bad, at least their faces don't, but their bodies often do, the clothes and the items often do. But then certain times when the lighting's hitting them just right, it looks gorgeous. And just to get into the more like the graphics versus the art design argument, a good comparison I think is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. On the Nintendo Switch, it doesn't have the most graphically powerful system there is. So they used the specific art design to get the most out of what they had. And that makes it a gorgeous game. The specific type of art design they used made it good looking. And I think that's what's happened here with Ghost of Tsushima. They've got limitations with what they can do with this hardware, with the amount of stuff they've got in this game, that they've had to change the art style and make it much more almost like a fantastical stylistic style of Japan and Tsushima to compensate for that. Graphically, I don't think it's bad, I just don't think it's great, I don't think it's as gorgeous as some people are making it out to be. So, Ghost of Tsushima, I think it's a long game, I think the story is okay, there are some moments in it which I really like, there are some moments which I was a little bored in. Gameplay is fun, constantly, but it is more or less the same. If you played an Assassin's Creed game, it's essentially that. The combat's a little different, but the stealth is essentially taken from Assassin's Creed. If you're a fan of open world, somewhat RPG elements, then you're probably going to like this. If you liked Horizon Zero Dawn I would say it's pretty similar to that, except you're not fighting dinosaurs and there's a lot less in the way of variety and fighting styles and techniques. But the open world element of that is very similar to Ghost of Tsushima. I do think Horizon Zero Dawn's a better game though. But yeah, Ghost of Tsushima, I thought it was okay. And those are my reviews for today. If I had to recommend one of those games, I would say Last of Us Part 2, so long as you played The Last of Us and its DLC. And that's all I'm going to talk about for now. Thank you for watching so far, and of course if you want you can subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate that. The more subscribers I get, the more content like this I can make. And of course go over to Twitter and Instagram, follow me at @the_GrantBurton to get more content like this. No, that's not where you go to get more content like this. You go to Twitter and Instagram, follow me at @the_GrantBurton to get all of my up to thoughts, opinions, details and whatever else I have going on. Until next time though, thanks for watching.